and let's get started. First, let's take a look at our agenda. You see the different steps that we're going to cover tonight. Each of these steps that we're going to talk about, there are four. I'm going to make sure to share some action ideas for you so you understand the concept and then have some practical ways to try to put it into use at your church. Again, I'll share discussion questions with you because we at MMFA have learned that it's really important for churches to be having conversation. Oftentimes we want to go straight to what are we going to do? But first, it's worth let's having a little conversation. Let's take time to talk before you jump to action. So I'll give you some good discussion questions to be thinking about in your church setting, and also share some metrics for each of these steps. Sometimes it's hard to measure the outcome of our stewardship actions or even church actions in general. Have we accomplished what we had hoped to? Have we moved the needle at all? So be sure to share some metrics with you for each of these steps that you can have a sense of how you can possibly measure it. So all that being said, one thing I do always like to say at the beginning of any stewardship webinar is that stewardship is not just one season. It's not one moment in the year for your church. It's a way of life. So as we look at these four different steps for your congregation, they're going to help you discover gifts that you already have, figure out ways to deploy those gifts beyond the church walls. We'll talk a little bit about how to preserve what matters in your church. Sometimes you can hear we're in preservation mode. That may not be a good thing, but tonight we're going to reframe that so that we're talking about in terms of stewardship, preserving what matters. And then we'll talk a little bit about adding a little friction. Sometimes we need to look at things that might make us uncomfortable, especially when it comes to money and the church. So we're gonna wrap up looking at that a little bit and how we add friction, healthy friction in our stewardship ministry. We'll finish with some time for questions and answers. So before we get into those four steps, if you've ever worked with MMFA for stewardship, you know that we say how important it is to ground everything you're doing in theology, in scripture. What does the Bible say to us about stewardship? So here you see some very familiar verses from Matthew. Jesus is speaking to folks who have gathered to hear him. And again, this passage is the foundation of our time together tonight. So Jesus says to the crowd, "You are the salt of the earth." He doesn't say to be salt. He doesn't say to try to be salt. He says you are salt. And that's worth thinking about here for a second. If you know anything about Jesus' time, salt was of high value for the culture. It was used to preserve food. It was used to prevent infection. I discovered as I was researching it more that it was used often as payment and is actually the root of our word salary. So salt was extremely valuable. So for Jesus to say, "You are salt of the earth," is significant. The Greeks associated salt with the divine. And Jesus tells us that that's what we are. So what does that mean for stewardship? It means mainly that stewardship's not primarily about what we give. It's about who we are. It's an identity, right? Because we are beloved. We matter to God. What we do with our time, our talent, and our treasure and our relationships really carry weight, and they can flavor, they can make a difference that lasts. So I like to think of it this way. God loves us so much, and we mean so much to God that we get to use what God has entrusted to us for God. That's salty stewardship. That's really understanding this is part of who we are as followers of Christ and as God's beloved children. So again, invite you to start thinking about stewardship as generosity that preserves, that adds flavor, and that makes a difference. And you see here at the end of this passage from Matthew that Jesus goes on to say, "You are the light of the world." And the beautiful thing about that, we know that we shine the brightest, not when we're looking inward and doing things for ourselves, but when we're pointing away to God. Our acts of service, our care for others, our generosity, these are all witness, not to how great we are, but to how great God is. So again, Jesus tells us, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." And this is an incredible invitation for us. for how we live our lives, and specifically for what we do that is called stewardship in our churches. So let's look at those four different steps for living out our identity in our communities of faith. And these steps are going to go well beyond probably traditional things that you associate with stewardship. And my hope, again, is that you leave tonight not with a to-do list necessarily, but with a sense of what needs to be talked about in your ministry over the months ahead, and possibly a renewed sense of who you already are: salt of the earth, light of the world. So let's get started. Our first step tonight is to know your ingredients. If you've ever cooked anything, you know that before you can get started, you have to know that you have the right ingredients. So just like that cook who's taking the inventory of what's in the pantry, a congregation needs to inventory what God has entrusted to them before anything can be used for God's work in the world. So stewardship is not about what we need. It's about looking at what we already have, having gratitude for those gifts, being aware of what's present. To encourage you to first thing first is ask a question: what do we actually have? Stewardship starts with this abundance of what's already there, building on where there is life in the church, where there are gifts, and determining how to use them. So take some time to think on your own tonight, over the days ahead: what do we actually have at my church? And put that question in front of others as you begin to think about stewardship in a different way. One way that you can know what those ingredients are is to do a community asset inventory. What are those skills, the spaces, the networks, the relationships, the resources, the energies that exist in your congregation? This is a great way to take stock. If you've done something like this before, I would invite you to consider when you did it, how much has changed in your church since then, and whether it's the right time to take inventory again. It can be really tempting to get stuck on what we don't have or what we used to have that we miss. And that can lead to some scarcity thinking that can be really dangerous, that sabotages our stewardship efforts. But we know that Scripture tells us a different story, right? 5 loaves, 2 fish, 12 baskets remaining. So encourage you to start taking inventory of what's there, the gifts that you do have, what God has entrusted to you as you start planning. Then to start thinking a little bit about your messaging. My experience in churches is that a lot of congregations unconsciously, unintentionally equate stewardship with fundraising. The pledge or the commitment card or the church budget become the whole conversation. And when this happens, stewardship can feel a little bit like a money issue that's dressed up in theological clothing. And that's really a dramatically incomplete definition of stewardship. The biblical word that is most often associated or translated, into stewardship literally means managing a household. And we all know, because we all manage households, that it's a lot more than just a bank account. If you're managing a household, you have to be responsible for property and skills and relationships and time and influence, all kinds of things. And a steward is responsible for all of these. So be careful as you consider how you talk about stewardship, what you share with the congregation, and make sure you're focusing on the whole life aspect, that it's everything that we do with all that we are all the time. It's time, it's talent, those traditional T's that we associate with stewardship. But it's a lot more than even those: time, talent, treasure. It's relationships. It's so much. Again, our whole lives. So consider how you talk about stewardship and make sure that you're not doing so in a way that leads people to think it's only about money. So whole life stewardship is the goal. And if that's true, then your pledge card doesn't disappear. If you're at a church that utilizes commitment cards or pledge cards, that process, it's still there. You're not getting rid of it. It's just one ingredient. It's just one thing that's in your pantry. And there's so much more in the pantry. It is not empty. So again, you've got space and property and skills and networks and people who care about making a difference. Folks who sit in your pews on Sunday who are concerned about things going on in your community, that want to do something to help. Those are all in your pantry, so to speak, gifts that you have that you can use for God's work. So strongly encourage you to take that whole life view, that inventory that accounts for everything, all the gifts that you've got. Keep your pledge card, just make it Again, one ingredient that's not overused in all of your recipes. If you're at a church where you don't have a pledging process, I strongly encourage you to consider it because not because the church needs it or it's going to help your budget, but because of how that act of making a financial commitment uh, is part of our walk of faith, is part of our relationship with God, and it can be very transformative. So, step one, know your ingredients. Now, let's look for a second at some specific action ideas. Touched on this a little bit, but first thing that can be incredibly fun and life-giving, energy-giving is to have an asset inventory Sunday. One way that you could approach this is to have members come in, they list one skill they have, one relationship that they have that could be used for the church, one resource that they bring. So it's those individual gifts that they have. You bring those all together into this sort of living ingredient list for the congregation, and then start to dream of, okay, how could we use these gifts together as a church? This is a little bit different than asset mapping. If you've ever participated in any kind of asset mapping, that's typically about congregational assets. What do we all have together? So similar process, overlap between the two, and it could be that you could merge the individual piece with the congregational piece and have one really incredible asset inventorying time together as a church. Then would encourage you to map those out, literally create a congregational asset map. Where's the church located? What community? Put it on the map. Where do your members live? Where are the schools within a certain mile radius of the church? Social service agencies, all the different potential neighborhood partners that you could have, the assets of your community, put those on the map. You may want to have a layer of skills and time. If you were to learn that, you've got 10 retired folks who are all free on a Tuesday morning, that is a wonderful piece of information that you could do something with. That's a gift. So that's one of your assets, people's availability. So in this visual that you're creating for the congregation, you've got those physical locations of assets, but you can also layer in what are those expertises that we have and the time and the availability that we've got that we might want to consider as we're figuring out how to use all of these gifts. Third bullet point you see there is want to make sure that you're aware of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. They have tons of free resources. I'll share their website with you. You can do a quick Google and find it, but I'll provide that in the materials that come with the link to the recording of tonight's session. But these are some great tools to use, again, for some individual gift identification. You see there the 4-H gifts. Those are gifts of the head, the hand, the heart, and habits. So it helps people look at their own gifts through those 4 areas. Or you could utilize the Know, Teach, Learn tool, which is a way for people to say, these are things I know how to do. These are things I could teach people how to do. And here are things I want to learn. So again, a great way to see gifts in your congregation in a different way. People have fun completing these kinds of inventories together. A way to build energy around what do we have, abundance, as we start thinking about what we want to get into in the community. So I encourage you to take advantage of those free resources that are available there. Another idea is a stewardship discovery team. The churches I know that have done this, they're so much fun. It's a small group of 3 to 5 people max. They have a 90-day charge to go out and list every single gift they see in the church. And then to have a plan for how are we going to acknowledge these gifts and say thank you for them? How are we going to celebrate them? So you could have a group working April, May, June, and you may have another group that says we want to take a 90-day shift later in the year. So this isn't necessarily a one and done, but it's really fun. It's usually easy to get people to do it, and it creates a culture of gratitude for the stewardship that's at work in your church. People like it when their gifts are acknowledged, even if they're humbly behind the scenes doing the work. It feels good to have somebody say, hey, thank you for that work that you're humbly doing behind the scenes, right? So a stewardship discovery team might be something that you want to think about to have at some point this year. And then finally, if you do use a pledge or a commitment card, consider redesigning it. Is there a way that you could also invite people to make a time commitment, a skill commitment for the year ahead? This is not the same as a time and talent inventory, if you've ever done one of those, but this is giving people space on their pledge card as they're making a financial commitment to also make a commitment of another kind. And it signals to folks that you value those non-financial gifts as much as you value the financial ones. So could be a good time to reimagine that pledge card and make space for folks to be indicating commitments in other areas as well. Here are a few metrics. I'm not going to read through each of them. Again, these will be in the slides that you'll get after tonight's webinar, so you'll have all of this in front of you to look back on. But as you're thinking about knowing your ingredients, the goal there is an awareness, right? To have an abundance mindset as you look at what gifts do we have. So any metrics that you identify should reflect that discovery part of the process of knowing your ingredients. So again, you see a few here that you might want to consider as ways to measure your efforts as you know your ingredients. And finally, here are some discussion questions. Again, I'm not going to read through all of them, but really I want you to have a way to have conversation about this content with the right folks in your church. That could be a stewardship committee. If you're at a church that doesn't have one of those, it could be unified board, joint board, elders, trustees, whomever. MMFA's observation over the years is that stewardship efforts are more successful when those folks who are on your boards are involved in the decision making and being aware of what the plan is. So I would encourage you, if you can, to have board level conversations around these different areas. Again, just pick one question for a meeting and see what happens. But it's about not just jumping to action. We're going to try this one new step, but really engaging people in some meaningful conversation before you determine what it is that you're going to do. So let's go on to our second step, seasoning the neighborhood. Why are we seasoning the neighborhood? Well, we know that salt doesn't stay in the salt shaker. So a church that's taken stock of its ingredients is now following the call, following Christ's example to use those gifts for God's work in the world, not inwardly only for the benefit of the congregation, but outwardly for the betterment of humankind and creation. So this is really important salty stewardship that's moving from sort of an act of maintenance within the church walls to one of mission, to really being hands and feet of Jesus and following the example he set for us as stewards. But before you can get started seasoning the neighborhood, you have to be aware of the needs that exist and how your gifts can help meet those needs. So this section is a little bit about closing the potential gap that might exist if your church is assuming that you know what neighborhood needs are and what possibly your neighbors are actually experiencing. So you see the first step is ask your neighbors, talk to them. And by talk, I really mean listen. Find ways to engage the people who live within a 1 mile radius, a 2 mile radius, however you want to define it, and find out what are their concerns, what needs do they have? Are there social service agencies close by where you can go in and listen to somebody on staff and just find out, again, what they're up to, needs of the neighborhood, and begin to think, hey, how might a church like ours with our gifts help with this need? So taking time to talk to neighbors. Second thing that you can do as you're in learning mode, learning about needs, is to build a community profile. And I'm giving you a tool here that I only just discovered late last year, and it's wonderful. It's the Association of Religious Data Archives, ARDA, and you have the website there. I'll send it to you in the handouts as well. But you go on and there's a button where you click about build a community profile. You'll go in, you'll type the church's address, and then it'll ask you, do you want a 1 mile radius, 2, 3? You can do it however you want. And then for free, it will generate this wonderful report that has so much rich demographic information in it. Things about housing, education, income, all kinds of aspects that are important for you to be thinking about as you get to know your neighborhood. I used this tool recently with a church here in Winston-Salem, and the interesting thing about it was that within a 1 mile radius of the church, their neighbors, which they knew, but they learned a lot more about them in terms of the level of their affluence. They were highly educated, etc. But when the church started talking about these are the ministries where we feel gifted and called, in the broader community, that profile of Winston-Salem, Forsyth County looked very, very different than the immediate neighborhood of the church. So it's just a great way to learn more about what's going on in a certain radius around your church building and help you start to narrow in on, okay, gifts that we've got, needs that are here, what are we going to do? So arda.com, the arda.com, highly recommend. MMFA can also generate this report for you. We can share it with your board and guide you through a 2-hour session that helps with that gift identification, with the needs conversation, and then putting the two together. Those are a lot of fun to do with joint boards, and be happy to do that with your church if that's something you'd be interested in. So now you've done the work. You've listened to neighbors, you've built out a profile, you've got more data to help you understand what's going on in the area around your church. So you get to the point where it's time to align the gifts that you have with needs. One of the things that we see in churches where there's burnout with ministry is often it's a congregation that may have gotten smaller, trying to sustain all different kinds of missions and outreach and activities that have been going on for years, and there just aren't enough people to keep it going. So this is an opportunity to say, okay, what are the gifts we have now? What are the needs that we see now? And where do those two things overlap? Which leads nicely into the next bullet, which is an invitation for you to consider something called hyperlocal stewardship. Many churches partner with a lot of different agencies, support a lot of different causes, and they're doing a lot of good. And this is very good. But hyperlocal stewardship is a chance to go deeper with one area, a small geographic area, one need that you're going to pour resources into. You're going to go all in on for a year to see if you can really make a difference, see some improvement. I think that this also helps build really meaningful relationships because you're showing up again and again for this need and working on changing it. And then the church is, again, better able to see if things are improving. And it really gives you a great message for financial stewardship conversations. If you're able to say, hey, this year we are committed to deepening our work in the Southside neighborhood, and we're working to alleviate the number of families who are experiencing hunger. That tells people exactly where their money is going to go when they make a financial gift. So that can be an incredible motivator for people. They like saying, hey, we're overwhelmed by all the needs. Let's look at one and let's go all in on trying to make a difference there. And then finally, to that point, make sure that you're telling stories and communicating with people in a way that they see impact. So if we think about a church, let's say, that's offering some health wellness activities. They've got a group of retired nurses, and those nurses are helping lead some chronic disease management classes. Then it's being able to interview people who've taken the class and using those impact stories as you talk to people about financial stewardship. So always having personal stories is really, really important. Numbers are great. We served this many people. We fed that many people. Numbers are wonderful, but they don't convey impact the way those real personal quotes and stories do. So make sure you have an eye on how you're really sharing that tangible impact with people. Let's look at a few specific action ideas for seasoning the neighborhood once you've listened and learned about needs. Again, up to the point of hyper-local stewardship, making a very public 1 mile commitment. We're going all in on this one tangible need within a 1 mile radius of our church, and we're committing real sustained resources to it for a year. What could that look like? Consider adding a dedicated line item to your church budget for community investment. Even a small amount helps tell the congregation that we're really serious about this, making a difference in this area, and adding that hyper-local stewardship line item to your budget is a great message to send to the congregation so they know what their generosity is going to support. Local partnerships. Is there one neighborhood institution where you can show up again and again? If you've already got some partnerships, take some time to evaluate them and ask yourselves, how deep does this partnership go? How many people from the congregation are involved with it? If it's just a handful, that may not be the right partnership for the church right now. Does someone from the organization get to have any input on what's happening in the relationship? Who's setting the agenda? Do you listen to those folks in the partnerships as you're thinking about budgeting and making ministry decisions? If your pastor left, would that partnership survive? So there's all kinds of questions that you can use to help evaluate existing partnerships and make sure that they are still ones that are the right fit for the church, given the gifts that it has and the needs that it's trying to meet. Finally, you see a SALT Commissioning Sunday. I think this could be a really meaningful way to enhance your stewardship ministry this year. This is a worship service where the congregation is symbolically committing resources to neighborhood flourishing, neighborhood needs. It's not just about turning something in or signing people up. It's about really commissioning members who are then being sent out. So it could, again, be a wonderful addition to what you're up to this year if you're focusing on that being the salt of the earth. Again, some metrics, won't go through them, but as we think about seasoning the neighborhood, that's all about outward movement out of the doors of the church into the neighborhood and the community. So metrics that you set, any of them, whether it's the ones on the slide or ones you come up with, should really reflect the potential to measure community impact. One of my favorite quotes is, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." It can be hard sometimes for us to measure ministry impact in general, stewardship impact specifically. You may do something and have no idea if it has changed how someone's going to decide to give. So, with that being said, it's still really important in the spaces where you can know to try to set some goals that you can measure. So, again, you see a few examples there for seasoning the neighborhood. And more discussion questions, sharing those with the right group at the right time. Again, pick one or two, go through them all on your own, however it works for you and your context, but being sure to have a conversation before you jump straight to action is key, and I can't say it enough. All right, let's move into our third step, which is preserving what matters. So, as we all know, one of salt's oldest functions is preservation, to protect food, and to protect anything that's valuable from going bad. So, for stewardship, this means thinking about the long game and how we're forming the next generation. What disciplines, what values, what stewardship practices that are important to the congregation are being preserved and passed on to those who are in younger generations. And this is not about preserving the church so that it can't evolve, so that it can't change. Preservation mode can be a bad thing in church settings, but this kind of preservation is not getting in the way of evolution or change that's needed, but it's to ensure that the faithful and generous stewards are being formed year after year for generations. So you see some examples here on the slide that are focusing a lot on children and youth. If you're already thinking we don't have a lot of children and youth at our church, don't worry, we're going to talk about that kind of preservation here in a minute. But first, let's look at these few points here in front of us. Developmental research shows us that children as young as 3 already can exhibit generous behaviors, and that by the age of 6, they have a pretty good understanding of fairness and sharing. So steward formation needs to start in early childhood. It needs to start at young ages. So ask yourself, when are we starting to talk about stewardship with our children? Because it should start in early childhood. Then spend some time thinking about what you want children to understand about stewardship. There are all kinds of curriculum out there. So before you start exploring resources as a group, identify, what do we want our kids to learn about stewardship? What does stewardship mean to us as a congregation that we want them to understand? You may need to spend a little time answering that as a church. But once you know, hey, this is what we believe about stewardship here at Ex Moravian Church, here's what we want our kids to learn, then you're ready to choose a curriculum. MMFA would be happy to help if that's something that you'd like assistance with. You for sure want a curriculum that's focusing on whole life stewardship, helping children understand all aspects of stewardship, that incorporates lots of Bible stories and scripture so they understand how this is grounded in who we are as followers of Christ. And then ideally, your curriculum for kids is going to align with what your adults are learning. You may be thinking, our adults aren't learning anything about stewardship in Sunday school or in small groups. So that's another step to consider, because research shows us that kids being formed in a certain area really benefit from having parents who are also being formed in that same area at the same time, so that they can have conversations about it, ask questions, and grow as a family. So choose a stewardship curriculum, and then consider how your church can connect to different generations. Intergenerational relationships are really, really meaningful as you're thinking about, how do we preserve what matters to us as a church. Those are folks in your pews who are your elders, carry lived wisdom about stewardship and generosity that no curriculum can replicate, right? So how can you connect those younger members with your older members so that they can learn from one another? And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Finally, ultimately, preservation, again, isn't about preserving the church to keep its doors open and get its bills paid. It's really about sharing this way of life that we all experience as God's children, as stewards, and making sure that all generations understand that this is a beautiful part of what God wants for us. So, congregations that are able to pass it on, that are able to do this well, are ones that are telling their stories, that aren't assuming that everybody knows certain things. So, there's rich storytelling around who we were in the past, how we got to be where we are today. You're involving those next generations in really important decision making, and you're connecting that the present of the church to the future. One way I saw this lived out recently in a church, totally unintentionally, was in a lunch, and I heard an older member telling a younger member about how the church had the money to build the fellowship hall and the building in which they were standing. And he told a really short story. It wasn't particularly long or detailed, but he was able to tell this young person about this incredible generosity at this moment in time, that enabled the church to have this building. And then he went on to say to the young person, what kind of things would you love to see happening in this fellowship hall? What do you think? What kind of needs could we meet? What could we do in this space that would be really cool, that would really help us be a missional church out there serving other people and loving other people and sharing God's love with them? So this young person lit up with some ideas right there in the moment. So this is pass it on, right? It's older generations telling stories, relating to young people, and then asking them questions, letting them be involved in the dreaming and the visioning and the discerning, for what the church is up to in the world. So preserve what matters. Let's look specifically at some action ideas. First one here you see is a youth generosity project. If you've got a youth group, give them a budget of a few $100s if you can. I imagine you could find folks that would be willing to give that, and let them decide how to use it in the community for good. This act of them deciding together and having to build consensus, of course, is formative for them and will serve them well if they ever end up on the church board. But it also gives you the opportunity to help them understand a little bit about how important it is with our stewardship, all kinds, not just financial, to be transformative versus transactional. If your youth come together and they say, hey, we're just going to give $200 to the Humane Society, done, project complete. That's great that they chose to give that money in that way, but it's very transactional. It's here's a check and then we walk away. What you want them to see is the transformative and aspect of stewardship that we experience when we engage deeply, when we build relationships, not just give money, but also give time and talent, etc. So that's part of the Youth Generosity Project, is helping give them exposure to that meaningful kind of stewardship. Another thing that's really, really important, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is to have resources available for your families for stewardship. Again, if your children are being taught lessons in Sunday school, what do their parents know? What do they understand? And how can they engage the kids in meaningful conversation as a family? So making sure that parents feel supported and have what they need to be forming their kids as stewards on their own time in their own homes is really helpful. Next, collecting and sharing generosity stories. This is a great space to have some intergenerational partnerships, youth interviewing older members of the church, having a set of questions around the church in general, but specifically maybe about generosity and times in the life of the older person when they've been able to be generous and see God at work through that, whatever it looks like. But you've got a great opportunity to collect and share generosity stories as a church. I've worked with churches before where they've just asked members to submit those, and that can be successful. It can also be frustrating if people don't do it. So I think if you put any youth that you have in charge and let them do some interviewing, that could really be exciting for everybody in the congregation. And then finally, a mentorship program. I know a lot of our churches during confirmation will pair a student who's in the confirmation class up with a mentor. If you do that, then consider what it could look like for that mentorship to continue as that teenager becomes a young adult. If you don't do something like that, that might be a thing to consider. If you're at a church where you don't have a lot of kids or youth in confirmation class, I would imagine there are adults that would love a mentor. I've seen this play out before in churches that have a lot of skills like woodworking or gardening, knitting, and you've got adults that want to learn about that, and they want to be paired with somebody who has a high level of expertise on it, who can be kind of a mentor for them, and that can evolve into more than just that specific sharing of that skill. It can become a broader mentorship. So there's opportunities there, again, to be forming connections, relationships, relationships, stewarding those relationships with youth, with older adults, that can help you really preserve what matters to the church. Metrics. So, as we think about preservation, these are slower, more relational steps that we're taking, right? We're building trust, we're putting youth with adults, we're partnering people up. So, here you see some suggested metrics that are going to take time. This isn't going to happen overnight, but again, a worthy investment. And I think people of all ages really benefit from some intentionality here. And finally, discussion questions for you to use as you would like as you think about this preservation aspect of stewardship. I especially like the last one. What is most at risk of being lost in your congregation stewardship culture if the next generation doesn't receive it? I am sad to work with a lot of churches where not a lot of stewardship education's happening at all for adults or children, but especially for children. And I hope that churches will consider what are we going to lose if we don't pay attention to this. All right. Let's look a little bit. If you're in a church where you're thinking, gosh, we don't have a lot of kids or youth, what are we going to do in this space? We've got some alternative suggestions here to look at. First thing that you can do is reframe who you consider to be the next generation. So maybe that's looking outside the church walls. Is there a college nearby with students nearby campus? Is there uh, do you have younger neighbors in the area who don't have a church background? Are there young families that you come into relationship with through a community partnership, that kind of thing? This is really expanding the scope and saying, okay, how is our church connecting with younger generations? And how can we develop those relationships and make them more meaningful? The other thing that you can do is look inside the church and say, hey, we may not have children or youth overflowing the sanctuary on Sundays, but you probably have members who are in their 50s, in their 40s, which are maybe younger than the average age of your church. So look at those adults because oftentimes they are not as involved in congregational life or decision making. We tend to make presumptions about how busy they are. They're still working, they're raising children, and we may unconsciously not bring them into things they would love to be involved in. So think about those folks and how you relate to them. And also consider who in your congregation holds that institutional memory and who doesn't have it, and see if there's a gap there. Again, I've sat in my own church and thought, gosh, we presume everybody knows really interesting things about this church, and we're not talking about it, we're not telling stories, and a fear again that it's going to be lost. So just an awareness of people who are there. Again, they may not be children and youth, but who are your adults in a younger age bracket, and how are they engaged in the life and ministries of the church, and what do they need to be involved in so that you feel like you are passing along what's important to the congregation. Another way that you can preserve what matters is to form a relationship with a younger church. Maybe there is a church getting started in your area that needs space. They could rent space from you. Maybe they're up to a ministry that you could be involved in, partner with them on that and collaborate. Or maybe you look at what a younger congregation in your neighborhood is doing and saying, hey, yeah, that's something we believe in. We don't have capacity to do it, but we've got some financial resources we could help support their work. So again, this is a sort of a radically different shift with the preservation model, but I think it could be a powerful one for your church to make if you don't have a lot of kids and youth. Then you see spend time discerning. I think it's really important to think about what preservation means if you don't have a lot of kids in your congregation. If you're thinking of preservation in terms of this is how we transmit what's important to us, our stories, our impact, resources, that kind of work is available to any congregation, regardless of your age profile. It's just going to look different. I also think that there is real pain for a church that doesn't have a lot of kids and youth, and spending some time working on that, healing from that, and saying, who are we? What are we doing together? Even as we are, it hurts that we don't have kids and youth, could be really important and powerful as you're thinking about stewardship this year. And finally, passing it on could look a little bit different in your church. Maybe it's a focus on what members want the congregation's resources to accomplish after they're gone. Maybe it's a plant and giving focus. Are there neighborhood partnerships that the church wants to endow? Ministries that you want to support that may outlive your members, that kind of thing. Again, this can be a difficult work to do. It can be a difficult topic to talk about, but I think it's an often unexplored form of preservation for your church that can be really impactful and meaningful. MMFA always happy to help guide this kind of conversation if it's one that you'd want to undertake. All right. Now let's look at our fourth, final, last but not least step as we think about salty stewardship, adding a little friction. So, why am I framing it this way? Salt changes things, right? It can make us thirsty. It can sting. So it can add a little friction. If you think about Jesus and his ministry, he certainly modeled loving, salty truth telling, especially when he talked about money. So, faithful stewardship, Jesus invites us to ask hard questions about things like wealth and inequality and transparency and the gap that can sometimes exist between what we say we believe as a church, but then how we're actually using our resources. So, invitation to follow Jesus' lead and be willing to have some hard conversations potentially around stewardship and especially financial stewardship. So here you see several questions that might add a little friction that you should consider asking with your church leaders. How does your church talk about money is the first one. Do you only talk about money when you're asking for it? Do you only really talk about money once a year as part of a financial appeal? Do you share budgetary shortfalls every week in your bulletin? If you do, please stop. There are a lot of better ways to invite generosity than doing that. So there's always room for growth in how ministries talk about money. And the first thing I would say is that you should never be talking about money apart from the church's mission. That is a whole nother webinar for another night. But if you're thinking about, hey, this is how we talk about money or don't talk about money, and you want to change that, be sure as you start talking about money more that you're linking it to the church's mission all the time. Second question to consider is how do you identify obstacles to financial stewardship? I've sat in a lot of meetings, I bet you have too, where we come up with all kinds of ideas about why people aren't giving. There is opportunity here to go out and learn more about this and to have healthy, intentional conversations with folks about stewardship. So would encourage you to do some listening within your own church and try to figure out how to remove some of those obstacles that may exist to financial stewardship. Again, MMFA, happy to help with this. Then consider your budget, your budgeting process. Is it fully transparent to the congregation? And what would change if it were? So, how can you make sure that people know how decisions are made about how church money is being spent? And this is more than just a vote in a meeting, but really sharing the whole process itself and involving the congregation in a different way. That can be a little scary for some of your trustees. May not be a risk that everybody feels comfortable with, but I think we tend to feel like we're more transparent than we are. And we've got a whole list of financial transparency tips that we can share if that would be something that would be helpful for you. And then finally, and I think possibly most important, determine whether your actions are speaking louder than your words. What does this mean? Does your church spend money in ways that align with its vision, its mission, its values? I like to say that this is similar to if I were to tell you tonight, I really prioritize health and wellness, and you go to my car and you open the door and you see receipt from Krispy Kreme and an empty McDonald's bag and all kinds of signs that I've been consuming things that are not about health and wellness. That's the point here. Is your congregation saying we are all about outreach and education, but pulling back how much money it invests in those particular things? You want to make sure that whatever you are doing in terms of how you use congregational resources is in line with your mission, and that you're clearly linking budget with mission. If you are sitting there saying, I'm not sure my church has a mission statement, I don't know that we have a vision, not sure that we articulate what our values are, let's start there. Those things are really important to have before you start inviting people to give in different ways as stewards. All right, action ideas for adding a little friction. Hopefully, you're not squirming in your seat too much. I know we don't like to talk about money, but first one would be to have some small groups around faith and finances. Great for these groups to be intergenerational. You may think, gosh, the people at my church who are in their 60s and 70s, they're financially sound. They don't need to be part of conversation groups. Yes, they do. When MMFA has gotten to lead these, everybody gets something out of them. The young learn from the old, and vice versa, and they're rich, meaningful conversations. There are all kinds of great resources in terms of books and short reflection guides that you can use for these conversations. I'd be happy to share some suggestions with you, figure out what might be right at your church if you decide you want to form, again, some small groups that are looking at finances through that faith lens. So topics that you might dig into in that space would be debt, giving, consumption, economic anxiety, inequality. God doesn't want us to be worried about money, but so often we are, right? So these small groups give folks a place to talk about that, learn about that together, again, for any generation. Second suggestion I'd have for you is to spend some time creating a stewardship reflection guide for your church. If you are at a church that's going to have a financial appeal this fall, you're going to invite people to turn in a pledge or commitment card. Give people something to have at home that invites them into prayer, discernment, some Bible study, reflection before you ask them to show up with that commitment. Yes, you are probably going to preach about money on Sunday. You're going to have people do speeches during worship about ways that they give, time, talent, etc. That's common in a stewardship messaging time of year, but really letting people have something that they can take home, have in their hands, and work through on their own, I think is really important. One, because you may have folks that miss worship, and so this engages them if they're not there on any given Sunday of your stewardship series. But two, I think these decisions are deeply personal. They can be, if folks are married or have families, they need to have conversation with others. And so this gives them some tools for that. So encourage you to create a reflection guide. Happy to help make some suggestions on that. Third, preach about money. Do a sermon series on money. If you follow the lectionary, go ahead and look at the text and see which of these throughout the year would lend themselves to rich stewardship sermons. When MMFA has surveyed lay people in the past about what they want for stewardship in their church, what they dream of, what they wish, majority of people say they want their pastor to teach them about stewardship, about what the Bible says about stewardship. So I hope if you are clergy on the webinar tonight, you feel like you're at a church where you're empowered to do that. If you're a lay person, make sure that your pastor knows they are supported in that, and probably that's what your congregation wants. So making sure you're preaching about stewardship in general, but financial stewardship specifically is really, really important. And then finally, budget town hall. We're back to being transparent about the budget process. So again, this is not just about bringing everybody together to vote to approve a budget, but it's about really explaining where's the money going and why, and what does it say about who we are as a community of faith? What should we change? Daring to ask the congregation for their input here, I think could be really meaningful for your stewardship. It, again, may cause a little bit of friction, but hopefully you've got board members who are prepared to have good, healthy conversation around the budget and how that those decisions are made. So let's look finally at some metrics. Again, not going to read through these, but as you think about adding friction, really the ultimate goal here is culture change. It's hard. It takes time as well. So you're going to see metrics that reflect openness and transformation. I would really love to work with a church and hear folks say, gosh, over a course of a year or two, people became more comfortable talking about faith and finances. We didn't have to worry about folks squirming in their seats so much. So again, just a few suggestions for metrics as you think about this friction point. And then finally, some discussion questions for you to think about. Typically, your trustees certainly could engage around these because they're heavy in the financial space. But I always encourage the more the merrier, joint board, unified board, stewardship committee. That final question is my favorite. What do you think Jesus would say to your congregation about its current financial practices as well as its stewardship ministry? MMFA has a whole separate webinar or session we can do with churches about Jesus as a steward, the four different ways he modeled stewardship for us. So that might make a great learning series for your church. Let's learn about who Jesus was as a steward. It can oftentimes make these conversations easier when you anchor them in Jesus and in God. So it's not about you, the trustee, or you, the stewardship committee member, asking for money. It's you teaching what Jesus taught about money. So let Jesus speak for you and consider what Jesus would say about your stewardship ministry at your church and let that factor in to what you get into this year. All right, I am going to stop recording, stop sharing, and just open it up in case anybody has any questions.